is fine as well.
Right.
Yeah, we're good too. See
CG is fine as well.
Okay. Yeah, and if anything else, like you guys can withdraw consent later on. I will keep time using time capped, and then if but I suggest you guys keep your own times as well. That is not time capped, that is a VPN. Okay, without further ado, I now invite the Prime Minister. You're here.
Okay, if everyone's ready. Okay, 3, 2. Recognize that the power of these companies has genuinely not only become absurd, but has become corrosive of even the most basic tenets of democracy and of people deciding what they want to do with their lives and how they want to be governed, and have extended far beyond the spheres of commercial practices and pricing. Recognize that the antitrust system was created in an era in which this was not the case, in which prices and quality of products were the only questions which companies answered, and services they provided as benchmarks by which those services can be assessed. That is no longer the case given the massive involvement these companies have in social media, in political lobbying, and in the ability to sway decisions based on economic factors relating to their political impetus. So, first of all, before we get into substantive, a few clarifications as regards to what is the motion and how we'll implement it. So first of all, this will mainly be about companies such as Facebook or Amazon. Now, the types of threats, but obviously we'll assess this on a case-by-case basis, right? The types of threats to the democratic process we'll be looking out for are, first of all, political lobbying leading to political capture to such a degree in which you cannot pass laws against these companies and cannot regulate them because they massively sponsor races and campaigns of politicians which are in government and thus gain favor and curry favor for them, such that they will never get regulated, given that will harm the re-election chances of any of these politicians. Second of all, the second thing we'll look out for is massive allowance and encouragement of propagation of fake news, of disinformation, and of electoral manipulation. This is something that Facebook routinely engages in terms of allowing it in order to gain more profit. And this looks like, the classic fake news, but also electoral manipulation by foreign interferences. See Russia in the US elections of 2016 and very likely 2020, creation of bots, trolls, and so on, which substantively corrode the ability of populations to keep informed and to vote with information in mind, with accurate information in mind, as opposed to conspiracy theories. Third of all, the third thing we'll look at is using of economic clout for political gain, which results in further economic clout. So for example, Amazon using its economic clout to create a race to the bottom between regions within the United States because they force mayors and US states to lower health and safety regulations, even if it's against the interests of their citizens, because they have the size in order to compel that political decision, because it's a race to the bottom of who gets that one Amazon plant, which is on the market for settlement. Now, recognize this is a use of political capital and it's not regarding prices and so on. Now, as regards to how we'll enact this breakup, it's a standard breakup by natural product category. So overwhelmingly, all of these companies have a variety of types of products and series of products. We'll split them up as makes most sense in terms of separate products which they offer and keep those separate. We'll also split up the revenue streams, the budgets. We'll enforce different management upon each of the component companies, and also they can't reunite or cooperate in any way afterwards. Now, getting on into our arguments. And I think we have three main points here. But before that, I just want to clarify the note that antitrust laws, as we previously conceived it, was about the free market, right, and about prices and quality of products. The problem is the power of these companies has extended so much that it now breaches not only in the economic marketplace, but also in the marketplace of ideas, right, in the marketplace of voting, of persuasion, but also in the marketplace of political information and what people find out about, but also in the marketplace of controlling your elected representatives due to their size. In this scenario, we tell you regulation does not work, so you have to use antitrust legislation, which comes at a prior step before that in order to avoid these problems, right? I also want to point out that often, by the way, these effects on marketplace of ideas often have effects on price and welfare of welfare which their products create later on down the line, but those are difficult to identify from the get-go, and that's why you have to intervene on the democratic side first of all. So now, going on to our three substantive points. First of all, I want to point out that this policy has an important deterrence effect, which importantly, even without its considerations of what the breakup will look like, has a massive leads to a massive improvement for the status quo. The reason it has deterrence effect is because you only need to make one company as an example of using this legislation in the scenario of harming democratic principles, and then all of the other companies will fall into line because breaking up essentially destroys their business as they've seen it. But also note that this democratic interference isn't something inherent that these companies have to do, or something that is critical to their success or economic sort of capital, right? So they'll be very willing to trade it off in order to keep retaining sort of that company, or just at the announcement of this policy, or once an example has been set. We gain massive benefits from that and mitigate all the harms from the get-go, even without having to break up a lot of companies. Now, second point we want to bring to you. So clearly I've already touched upon the harms and how they're particularly harmful in terms of voting becoming irrelevant, politicians not implementing the policies which their people voted them in for, that people cannot get better rights and are oppressed by these companies freely, but also that products become more expensive and of less quality and with less innovation, not as an initial standpoint, which an antitrust regulator would see now, but rather as an effect of something like the Amazon crowding out of other competitors, which means there's a race to the bottom in terms of democratic principles, which leads the health and safety regulations to go down, right? Now, I also now want to move on to, first of all, why the size of these companies is a key factor which has to be addressed, which results in these harms. Size is the problem because of 5 reasons. First, political fundraising. In order to do political fundraising, you need massive amounts of cash, massive amounts of funds to be able to run these races. If you don't have them, you can't exert political control. Second of all, lack of competition. If there's no competitors, then another competitor can't gain an advantage by accepting the regulation. There's only one in your field, like Amazon, right? Then you can just refuse that regulation outright, and there's no one to take up that competitive advantage of accepting the regulation. Third of all, it's unlikely that these companies will be regulated because, as I've said, it's generally unlikely that these companies will be regulated because of political lobbying, but even if you attempt to regulate them, they'll lawyer up and start class action lawsuits because they have the money to do so and attack you. Fourth of all, a lot of times are an extremely potent and easy target for external interference because their size is massive. Facebook's size is massive, which covers the whole marketplace, which is such an easy target for the Russians, and there's no replacement for it. If people don't like Facebook, they can't move to anywhere else because they own Instagram, they own anything else. So that's the ripest target for political misinformation and interference in an election. If you get rid of size by breaking up, that means that suddenly you don't have all of these issues because there are alternatives, there are competitors, and no longer does size cause democratic failing. Thank you.
All right, I thank the speaker. I now welcome Leader of Opposition.
Can I just check that my mic's working? So I've been having tech problems. Great. Welfare is a broader category than vague threats to democracy. It's about the ability for millions of consumers to access affordable products, loans, and powerful networks that uniquely come from economies of scale. Their model is going to fail in solving threats to the democratic process, but deny consumers the myriad of benefits that come from larger corporations. I'm going to start out by explaining our counter-prop, then refute PM, and then get into two arguments. Firstly, the benefits of big companies for consumers, and then secondly, why this will be a highly politicized process and shut down the wrong kinds of companies. Into our counter-prop. Firstly, we support campaign finance legislation under our side of the house. Note, we have a massive amount of fiat power to solve prop's problem. This is because being broken up for having a vague threat to the democratic process is obviously going to be very unpopular for companies under the status quo, and therefore we can just symmetrically use fiat power to implement other policies that are probably going to be more popular than literally having you broken up as a corporation. In addition to campaign finance legislation, we would also have a push to regulate fake news. And finally, as just a piece of characterization, we support the push under the status quo that exists in a variety of states to regulate companies, i.e. like more stringent data requirements for Facebook that is very politically plausible because people care about not having their data stolen, people care about accurate information, which is why these issues are becoming a lot more politically popular. And just some brief refutation. In terms of solving the problem of political lobbying, I don't think that this actually applies because the problem is not that you have a few large corporations, but rather when you have a myriad of small corporations, they're still going to agglomerate around shared interests. That is to say, they will still benefit from things like having lower regulations. So even if each individual company has less money, they don't shrink the pool of money overall. There's going to be designated to things like political lobbying. In terms of fake news, also unclear how breaking up these companies would solve that problem. Like when Facebook is broken up, where are people going to turn to news? Probably just smaller social media sites who also have incentives to propagate fake news, but even less money to be able to do things like buffer against this. In terms of deterrence, this is nonsense because there's always going to be pressure to grow as a company. In the short term, there's massive pressure from shareholders to continue to grow when they care about things like quarterly earnings report. And given that there's uncertainty about the exact time period where you're going to be broken up, it's a far more rational choice on behalf of shareholders to continually just try and maximize the bottom line of your company because you get the guaranteed immediate impact of more capital. First claim, what are the benefits of big companies for consumers overall? So we have to note that there are a large numbers of companies who they're going to break up, who are not being broken up under the status quo because they're beneficial under their consumer welfare standards, but due to like their large size and like they might find some politicians do pose a threat to democracy. Given that, why do you think it's really valuable to have a large like quantity of big companies operating? Multiple mechanisms here. Firstly, larger companies have cheaper prices. The first reason for this is that you have economies of scale, i.e. when you have more like fixed machinery, etc., and more established businesses, producing an individual cost of a good becomes cheaper because you don't need to continually purchase new kinds of technology to be able to do so. But secondly, as a large company, you're able to engage in cross-subsidization, i.e. if one portion of your company is doing poorly, you can just fund other parts of your company that prevents the economic necessity of price hiking to help the bottom line of your own company, which is really beneficial in allowing consumers to be able to access more affordable goods. Secondly, size is important when it comes to things like networking effects. What makes social media and technology companies so valuable for consumers is the large quantity of people who are able to opt into these shared systems, to opt into the same network that allows you to form things like valuable business and social connections. Thirdly, and this is really crucial, size is really important for innovation. The larger the company that you are, the more likely that you're going to be to innovate for two reasons. The first thing to say is that a larger capital buffer that comes from size allows you to take a greater quantity of risks. This is because innovation is a risky endeavor because you're unsure if investing in a product is going to have a guaranteed return end of the day, and therefore if you have a pool of money to fall back on as opposed to a newer startup, your cost benefit analysis will shift in favor of that riskier choice. For example, Google has a specific part of their businesses called Moonshoot that they're literally using for speculative ventures like self-driving cars that is exclusive to having a capital reserve. But secondly, you just need a lot of money to invest in innovation. R&D is really expensive because it often involves a lot of experimentation, hiring experts within their field. Smaller companies simply lack the capital to be able to do that successfully. The fourth reason that breaking up these companies is bad is that the process itself is very economically disruptive. This is because there's going to be an immediate hit to like the share price of your company when you literally announce that it's being broken up. And crucially, there's often a lot of economic interconnectedness between individual companies and other sectors of the economy, especially when they're large, because you often have like pension funds who might have bought bonds in those companies, or just individual consumers who are now going to lose a large quantity of money. The final mechanism here is that breaking up banks is something that is uniquely harmful. And note that banks exist under their mechanisms because they often have large quantities of lobbying power and do pay politicians. You need to have large banks because the greater the size that you have, the greater the pool of money, the larger just like the economic baseline that you have as a bank. This is important because the more money that you have as a bank, the more people that you're able to lend to. You have the kind of capital reserves where this is possible for you, and you're more likely to get regulatory approval if you can show regulators, I have this pool of capital to fall back on. This is really important because when you extend capital to a greater number of people, it allows them to then use that money to help their own quality of life. What then is the weighing of like all of the mechanisms that I've just told you against the best case gut scenario of benefiting the democratic process? A couple things. Firstly, large quantities of people are impacted by all the mechanisms that I spoke about. Literally every single person in society interacts with company. Everyone benefits from lower prices. Basically, everyone uses some form of social media. Everyone benefits from products that come from innovation, as opposed to a very few subset of people who actually vote and engage in the democratic process. But secondly, access to capital is a vital precursor of agency. There's no intrinsic value of democracy when it does not produce outcomes. I think it's far more important that we get the kind of outcomes that people actually fight for in democratic systems, like better medical treatments from innovation, like affordable goods. Second claim, why is this process going to be highly politicized? Due to ambiguous criteria, politicians can use this for highly politicized goals. Why is this standard so vague? Firstly, it is merely about a threat rather than a demonstrated harm. Literally anything theoretically could be a threat to the democratic process. There's nothing tangible to extrapolate from that. But it's very easy for governments to just like invent justifications about how this could theoretically pose a threat to the process. Checks and balances can't work because in terms of courts, they're often politicized as well. We have politicians who like appoint people to the courts and therefore they're beholden to political objectives. In terms of voters, you can't monitor like every single political case of these companies being broken up. What then are the impacts of like some political influence of this? Firstly, you re-embed the dominance of certain companies. If the prop case is true that companies like Apple have large quantities of political influence, companies like Apple, who may in prop's best case scenario have some political capture, are simply going to just use this to shut down their own corporate rivals, to break them up, to consolidate their own power. I mean, that you just exacerbate all of the prop harms of extreme market consolidation. Secondly, this is a direct way of targeting political foes and political rivals. People like Bloomberg, who own large media companies, who competing politicians like Trump are able to shut down those companies. You make electoral processes less competitive when you decrease the wealth of the opposition, but you also create an incentive for people to back down when you can use shutting down their corporation as a threat. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening opposition.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry, just putting papers in order. Yeah, I guess just type POIs in the chat and then I'll just okay you. Assume my mic is okay. Madam Speaker, it is terrifying to live in a world where there's more than 25 companies that have more profits than the GDP of entire countries. These are companies that have not just the capacity to influence your choice in regards to what product you buy or what clothes you put on your body. These are companies that have the capacity to influence the marketplace of ideas of every choice that you make in your life. The role of opening opposition wasn't to stand up here and say, oh, you might break up random company that's kind of big. What's to tell us why these enormous companies that have insane amounts of market monopoly, that have insane capacity to literally guarantee an election solely based on whether or not they offer you their money and their electoral support should continue to exist as they are. We think that the metric that we gave you for the companies we're breaking up is extremely high, extremely clear. We don't think they explain the harm of why these companies should continue to exist. Two things that I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, about why we think that this is necessary, and second, why we think this protects consumers and the democratic process overall. Before that, I want to make 2 points on the mechanism. Firstly, on the countermeasure that the opposition gave us, on this whole, we're going to use magic fiat to use campaign finance legislation. I think that, and this is sort of like one of the pet peeves that I have when you debating, fiat is not a magic power. And the problem with the opposition is that the very thing that we're telling you is a problem is the thing that is going to prevent them from exercising this magic amount of fiat. Because when companies go, oh, you are suddenly attempting to pass this like huge regulation that is not going to allow me to lobby anymore, they're obviously going to oppose it. And precisely because of the mechanisms that we tell you, that they have the capacity to lobby politicians to say, no, we're actually not okay with this. Those are the resources that they're going to throw at you. That's precisely the reason why on the opposition, they're incapable of passing the things that are necessary. That's when we tell you on opening government that if you want to control them, you first have to threaten to break them up or break them up completely. We don't think that their fiat applies in this debate. The second thing that I want to point out in regards to the mechanism is that the metric that Tudor gave you is actually an incredibly high bar. Think about what he told you. He told you that these are companies that in order to manipulate or to pose a valid threat to the democratic process, they have almost complete control of the market, which means that they're able to engage in a race to the bottom to avoid regulation, that they have so much money that they have the capacity to essentially guarantee an entire race when they propose to fund a particular candidate, that also they have maybe like a crazy CEO that decides to play electoral poker with whether or not Facebook actually influences your election choices. I think these are unique things that mean that very few companies actually meet this threshold. I think that this means that it is a really, really high bar. What opening opposition has to show us, and what I don't think they have shown so far, is why we should tolerate the first trillionaire on the history of the earth to continue to exist as they are unchecked when they deliberately mess with the democratic process and with consumers' choices. We don't think they have done that. First then, why is this necessary? I think that overall, and also I want to address why specifically there has to be antitrust laws, is because antitrust laws are meant to protect consumers from predatory business practices so they can freely exercise choice and engage in a marketplace of ideas that works. The problem, Madam Speaker, is that the capacity of companies to influence that choice has massively changed. Because of the internet and globalization, they have enabled themselves to grow to an enormous extent and to a level of wealth that just was not possible to conceptualize before the last century. But I think that more importantly is that they have now become literally impossible to control that, right? Because of the things that Tudor told you, how they engage in races to the bottom, where they're the only companies that can allow you a viable way to live in your town. When they oppose regulation and they have so much money that they can get that essentially not like siding with them on the lobby ballot means guaranteeing your party a death sentence in the election. When they have huge lawyer firms that they can engage to outcompete any other. When they have the capacity to, for example, lower their prices for a while to kill all competitors and then suddenly hike them up, and then you no longer have the capacity to engage well as a consumer. But also that means that, again, all of the other mechanisms Tudor gave you kick in, they become richer, they have more capacity to lobby. What does that translate into? I think it translates into two big harms for consumers. Firstly, in regards to the products, opening opposition says, yes, but now products are going to be cheaper. I think that that's sort of like, okay, yeah, when Amazon has to compete with other people, they have an incentive to reduce their prices and become cheaper. Once they have almost a complete monopoly, which is basically what they have right now, I don't know if the Amazon product I bought yesterday was actually cheaper than the real one because I didn't fucking look, because there's no other website that you can actually buy in. The problem is when they have a monopoly, that's when they remove your choice entirely. But more importantly, once they have that monopoly, it is when they have the capacity to sort of like completely remove your democratic choice, because that's when they have enough money to start lobbying in regards to you making kinds of bad choices. What are these bad choices? It is voting for politicians that are actively against regulating exactly these sort of monopolies, which creates an enormous, terrible, vicious cycle that allows them to gain more and more profit. It looks like voting for politicians that, again, are very against taxing the rich. I think that Jeff Bezos should maybe donate some of his trillions of bucks to children that are starving in Africa, but he won't, because, you know, he's not forced to buy taxation because they keep voting Republicans in, who suspiciously are also mostly funded by his own company. I think that that's problematic, and I think that that only kicks in once these companies are as powerful as Tudor told you. I think that our mechanism is very clear and very cleanly addresses why we think that this is going to fix it. Before I move on to my second question, Xiao. Ashish or Sharms, go.
Yeah, you make it look like Jeff Bezos is some Republican shill. Actually, he mostly donates to Democrats and owns a very prominent liberal newspaper. How do you explain that?
I think he also owns a Republican newspaper, which I recently learned in a Euros debate. But the point is that they like diversify their interests so that they guarantee that whichever party wins is going to be a party that has to side with them. So it doesn't matter if the Democrats win in November, because what Jeff Bezos is going to do is going to be like, hey, Joe Biden, remember when I financed your entire fucking campaign? You need to give me something now. You need to, you know, lower company regulations for Amazon, which is historically what the Democrats have also kind of done. So yeah, unclear. They have enough money to play both sides. We think that's damaging. Second, why does this protect consumers? 4 reasons, I think. Firstly, size. That's why they can do this, because they're enormous. Second, because of competition monopoly. Opening up says, but different companies can also act as a monopoly. But if I am a company, I can benefit from having better regulatory standards than this other one. So maybe I want to oppose government regulation because I am pro-regulation, because that gives me a competitive advantage. That doesn't happen when there's only one company. We don't think that mechanism works. 3, because the mere existence of these laws is a threat. The fact is that Facebook only fucked around with elections because they were allowed to, because there was no existing regulation that would. Now the Facebook stock owners are going to look at this and be like, look, if you do this, we're going to get broken up and our money is going to get cut in like a third of what we currently earn. You're not allowed to do that. So no more weird experiments for Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. We think that actually investors prefer to not milk a company for profit for 3 years because that's very unstable, and rather to stay with a steady profit that also doesn't meddle with elections. The fourth reason that I have is that this actually makes them more pro-regulation, because if you have regulation on you, that means that you're averse from risk, because countries cannot prosecute you because you're following regulations to follow democracy. I think that at the end of the day, this means that we have better capacity to regulate companies that otherwise we don't have the capacity to control. They have more money than us, they have more power than us. This is the only way to control them.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition.
I prefer verbal POIs, by the way, so just send me or just say something. Okay, great. Before I get into the meat of this speech, I just want to start off with some characterization, because I think the opening government team was a bit disingenuous about the size and scale of these companies. Let's be clear. Companies like Apple have approximately 40 to 50% of the market share in North America, and foreign phone companies have taken up a large percentage of that market share. It is not the case that these are sold bodies where there's no other competition. And the reason why you know this is true is because they don't meet the consumer welfare standard yet. If it was the case that they were a true monopoly with 80 to 90% of market share, they would already be engaging in monopolistic practices like jacking up prices. So their characterization cannot stand in this debate, given the fact that it has not reached that threshold yet. So that is important because it means that there is still competition within many of these markets, although there are oligopolistic tendencies in some circumstances, obviously. I'm going to chat about three things. First, I want to talk about whether or not this fixes the problem. Second of all, I want to talk about welfare and individuals and the economic well-being of people. And lastly, I want to talk about this being used as a tool of political manipulation. Let's start on whether or not this fixes the problem. And to begin with, I just want to be clear with why our counterprop exists in this debate. The government argument here is that there's going to be backlash if you try and push for regulations. You're going to lawyer up, for instance, and have class action lawsuits. Amira, I think that's going to happen when you break up the companies too, to be completely honest. If you think it is going to massively harm your company, you're going to engage in that sort of lobbying against any sort of breakup, so that harm is symmetric. Given the fact that you're able to overcome the lobbying in the instance that we have a breakup, I suspect that we can do so when we provide modest regulations in this debate. And so given that fact that those regulations do stand, now, obviously, the proposition bench might say, well, look, the problem is that in the long term, this company will get big enough that they can influence the political process. So we need to stop them now in order to prevent future harms. But note, our regulations prevent those future harms from ever occurring because they no longer have a political pathway to influencing politicians. The fact that, for instance, there are campaign finance limitations, no thank you, or limitations on the amount of news that you can find and fake news fact checkers. So that means that that harm is non-existent. But let's be charitable. Let's say that they are able to get some of these harms. Let's talk about each of the individual harms and explain why they do not work. First, on the issue of lobbying, what we established on the opening opposition from Naomi and what was not adequately responded to is the fact that you have cartels which form. Even if you break up a large social media company into its constituent bodies, all the individual social media companies like Instagram, Facebook, WeChat, etc., will come together and lobby Joe Biden with their collective money anyways. This is what large organizations like OPEC functionally do, where large conglomerations of different companies can coalesce on single issues. So you already get lobbying on either side of the house. The question is, does concentration make it worse? And what we did not get an answer about was that from our opening government.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, we actually flip this argument because they waste their political capital on an ineffective solution, but we provide campaign finance limitations, which fixes the problem. The second thing that they tell you is that there's a race to the bottom, that these are large employers who are going to control a single city and therefore dictate labor regulations. Two responses. First, we can see that this makes some regulations harder, but we think that there are countervailing incentives to exist. For instance, there's strong reason to believe in most cases there's still other employees within a city, and therefore you're still going to have competition to get employees because you as an employer want to treat someone decently in order to get them into your company as a whole. The second response that I do want to point out is that this just isn't specific to the motion. This justifies breaking up a big Walmart in a small town when they are the sole employer. So this is not a specific mechanism to dealing with that problem. And I think at the very best, it incidentally deals with it in a very narrow and limited set of cases.
Jason.
The third thing that they talk about is fake news and size. Our response on this issue is that on either side of the house, fake news will exist on social media platforms. The question is this: what side is better, the one with more resources or less? We posit that when Facebook has more resources, they're able to have more rigorous fact-checking and more administrators. So even if there are fake news on either side of the house, we think that we get a marginal win by being able to impose regulations and giving individual companies the ability to have actual funds to deal with it. Finally, on the question of deterrence, I just think they don't understand how most shareholders work. They do not hold shares for a long period of time. Many people who hold shares are just normal pension funders or institutional investors or the average mom and pop like you and me. And they only hold those shares for quarters or a year at max. That means that these time periods are not substantially long enough to create a long-run incentive to prevent you from growing too large as a company. And that's why companies grow too large in the status quo, because shareholders have short-term incentives. They don't actually analyze the details as to what shareholders think. I think we've demonstrated that this policy does not fix the problems that they noted, but I think we've actually flipped the argument and proven positive benefits on our side of the house. On welfare, I think that we gave lots of analysis here, so I'm going to deal with the glib responses we got from Lucia. Before that, go.
Your best case scenario is you set campaign funding laws that companies can later attempt to undermine. Our mechanism stops them from ever trying to do such a thing because that results in immediate and certain loss.
But my question is, how do they undermine it in the future? If they can't donate more money to political campaigns, they aren't going to be able to influence politicians to want to repeal the law. So you need to demonstrate to us how your mechanisms of political influence still occur even with our regulations, and that just wasn't done. On welfare, Naomi tells you quite a great deal. I think that there's a lot of it that still stands, particularly given the fact that these are industries with modest amounts of competition, meaning that the price reduction which comes from economies of scale also stands. We also told you about networking effects, and we told you about breaking up big banks. Now, I want to reaffirm a mechanism that we provided about capital buffers. We already established that these are deeply profitable companies that get lots of investment from shareholders, but there are also companies that are large and stable enough to get large loans to fund these sorts of programs. And that's why you get research into speculative programs and innovation in the long run. Now, the claim that we get from their side of the house is that there are long-term harms, that in the future you're going to have some kind of harm to consumers. But in the future then, when they have that demonstrated harm, we just break them up when they hurt consumers. And if their mechanism is on deterrence, then we can co-opt the deterrence argument in terms of long-run economic effects, because if they ever grow too large and start acting monopolistically, then we break them up, and that presumably has the deterrence effect that OG wants. So if deterrence is true, then we certainly win on economics. Finally, let's talk about fairness and all these sorts of issues in terms of whether or not this is going to be applied properly. And the claim that comes from their side of the house is simply that there's a very limited set of companies in which you can do this. But the definitions that you provided are quite vague. You have to stick with the model that you provided. And we gave you structural reasons as to why politicians will manipulate this kind of process. So saying that just a limited number of companies meet this criteria is incredibly vague, especially given the fact that companies like Apple, who you would presumably want to regulate, have 40 to 50% market share. How do you weigh this debate at the end? We think that the economic benefits affect everyone and that people in democracies are relatively disengaged given the fact that they only vote 40% of the time, so there's a revealed preference in favor of the economy. As a consequence, economic benefits are the most important and grant you autonomy in the rest of your life, much as democracy grants you autonomy over the political system. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker. Now to start off closing half, I invite member of government. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Three, two, one. Three extensions from closing government. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why the domination systematically infringes the democratic decision. What are the sort of profit model or the business model that exist under social media, which is systematically infringing democracy. Second, why democratic threat can be the criteria for breaking up. And lastly, why the criteria of democratic threat within itself incentivize the social media company to change its business model and to change its incentives throughout the sort of things that is happening within democracy. So firstly, we think that why domination systematically infringes democratic decision. The main alternative we hear from opening opposition is that there could be things like citizens, like criticism. There could be things like external, like intervention from these companies, and self-regulation can happen. But there are systematic reasons why social media companies have no incentive to deny to improve the existence of democratic threat within this company, i.e., things like misinformation or fake news industry that exists within social media company. The biggest reason is because they make money from that democratic threat. They are the ones who are contingent on this business model to make money, and that's why these kind of things are happening. What are the sort of things that we are talking about? Firstly, algorithm model. Facebook make $10,000 or $3,000 per month from this algorithm model. The number of clicks that the fake news get is important for these companies because they get money by providing the platform. That's why they want more people to click on the fake news, and they want more people to click on the advertisement so that this social media company can make money from that. But second, they're actively doing filter bubble, and they're actively creating echo chamber. This is precisely because they are able to, by having more people click on the link, by having more viewer for the website, having more time looking at the fake news post, for example, these social media company make this money. That's why they are actively swaying these people to look at this advertisement by creating artificial filter bubble based on the preference and based on the browser data of these users. That's why in order to increase the number of clicks that the users click, or the number of in order to increase the advertisement revenue that these social media company gets, they are actively creating this situation, and they are actively creating echo chamber, which reinforces the bias towards the minority individual, or which incentivizes people to think that Donald Trump is someone that they should vote for. Third of all, negligence to patriotic trolling, opinion shapers, and spam accounts, countries like Philippines. Facebook has technology to know that which looking at programs or like the past like record of the users, they know which users is like spam accounts, but they are not stepping in because they are getting money by having more number of users, by having number of users click on the advertisement revenue. We think this is harmful because A, they are able to create artificial opinion and the illusion of objectivity to make people think that voting for this person or voting for the Duterte is something good. Or B, this opinion shaper is able to send things like hate speech or death threat to threaten individuals to vote for Duterte under Philippines. That's why, for example, Duterte was able to create keyboard army or online fan base or like 12 million propaganda users and users to amplify the view and sway these voters to vote for him. Facebook is not doing anything precisely because they make money from the existence of this democratic threat. But fourth thing that Facebook does not engage to is things like Cambridge Analytica, information used to maximize Donald campaigning. They were able to use this information to improve their campaign or improve their speech. Or for example, TikTok is taking away private information, and they have the potential ability to leak it to CCP, but they are not doing anything because they realize that all these kind of things happening, but they make money, and that's why they are not stepping in right now. But lastly, manipulation of the search engine. For example, Google was able to sway to have more favorable results for like Hillary Clinton within the search result, precisely because they want more people to make, precisely because they want to make money from that. What is the implication of this? The implication, therefore, is that self-regulation is systematically not happening under their side because they make money, and this is based on the profit model and business model. Why is this something important, and why it deserves to be broken up? Firstly, we are talking about developing country context. Firstly, this is important because there's global user across the globe in terms of social media. But second, especially these individuals are the ones who tend to be reliant on this social media company, especially given the conventional media companies in this developing country seems to not be functioning. That's why, for example, Duterte was able to win election, despite the fact that he has things like terrible overpopulation within prison and disproportionate punishments for these people. Well, that's why, for example, Brazil, Bolsonaro is not dealing with COVID-19, but he is able to gain popularity precisely because of the social media negligence. But second impact is a minority. We think this is the most important because these individuals are the most vulnerable individuals. Under their side of the house, Trump is able to attack people like Muslim or women like abortion rights precisely because he is able to galvanize support by using the social media platform to attack these people and to gain support from these people using the echo chamber, and this kind of thing is reinforced within our side. Even the social media company are the one who profited at the expense of this minority and at the expense of this democratic failure. We think that social media it's legitimate to force this social media company pay for what it has done. But last impact is democracy. We think that ability to vote is something important based on your subjective priority and based on your interest. Given that these misinformation or fake news is hindering these people's ability to vote on their more best way, we think this is harmful. Firstly, why is this important? Firstly, because we think the concept of corporate right is only based on instrumental value. Given that it is not helping the citizens on the ground, we think we need to change this. But second, in terms of reciprocity, only when you have given that you pay tax or you listen to law, for example, we think that it's only legitimate when you are able to freely vote based on your democratic interest. Why is breaking up likely to change? Because they don't want to be bankrupt. They don't want to be broken up. That's why they are likely to listen to seize this freedom. We allow M&A. You need to do this A, B, C. We are able to conditionalize this company to follow these kind of laws uniquely within outside of the house when we have this breakup as a criteria for law. Firstly, because they have the technological ability, they are likely to do this. But second, because they want to avoid breakup, for the first time, they have incentive to intervene to things like patriotic pooling, using their unique know-how and the unique skills that they have. We think that for the first time, we are able to incentivize this company to change the incentive and to change the business model that they have right now. For these reasons, we are extremely proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, I thank the speaker. I now invite the opposition member. Here.
Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to what I'm sure is the universe's most spicy 2-point in recorded history. So this debate is not going to be won or lost based on benefits of monopolies. Maybe prices go up, maybe prices go down. There are good arguments on both sides. Maybe you have more innovation, maybe you have less because they're more lazy. This debate is about whether or not democracy survives. Not just in nice democracies like the kind of been talking about, like the US. This debate's about a much bigger question. Do we trust countries like Singapore, like Indonesia, like large swaths of sub-Saharan Africa with weak democratic institutions and with high potential of abuse? Do we trust these sorts of democracies, the vast majority of democracies in the world, to exercise these powers responsibly and not to abuse them? And we think the risks are huge. I want to go significantly beyond what the opening opposition gave you in talking about why all democracies, both good and bad ones, strong and weak ones, will be horrifically abused. But the other thing I want to do is tell you why there are structural incentives, apart from fiat, why it is that regulation, either self-regulation or from governments, is going to happen, and we already see it happening. So the doomsday scenario we see coming out from the opening government is simply false. Therefore, why do we think it's actually easy in many instances to regulate large monopolies of this sort? Firstly, because the big argument against regulation, i.e. that you push industry out of business, that you wreck people's livelihoods, that you destroy SMEs, does not apply to large multi-billion or trillion-dollar companies. This is why even Republicans hate Amazon and hate Facebook and hate Google, which is why all three CEOs were grilled in a bipartisan way just 2 weeks ago. Because the single biggest right-wing economic argument against regulation simply does not apply to them. Secondly, we live in a broadly populist mood now, right? It's basically very, very unpopular to be seen in cahoots with any kind of controlling force, whether that is, I don't know, the the international jury, if you're conspiracy theory minded, or if it's just large corporations, right? No, during the 2018 midterms in the US, also the most right-wing developed country in the world, candidates which did disproportionately well were those who publicly committed to receiving no donations whatsoever from super PACs or from corporations. So there's natural political incentives suggesting that there's reasons for people not to accept this money. Which is why when we hear from opening government that these things will just buy elections wholesale, there's just no evidence for that. If you look at the list of largest political donors, none of the companies they listed are on the top. It's things like the Koch brothers or Rupert Murdoch who are actually responsible for the large donations. On a very factual level, California, Nevada, Arizona, Canada just passed regulations specifically directed at Amazon's abusive practices towards its storehouse workers because it was massively popular on both sides of the aisle, right? So we again don't think this reality plays out. Thirdly, we think especially for social networks, your image is everything. If you are seen as permitting fake news and conspiracy theories to spread, you lose users in a massive way. The best example is Facebook. Facebook is facing a massive financial crisis because it's getting basically no users between the 16 to 25 demographic age, and it's losing most of them to other platforms with more aggressive policing policies like Instagram or Twitter, right, which now puts out actual correction notices. That is why Facebook recently started putting on videos a label which says, we think the information in this video is false, but we're not taking it down because it's in the public interest to still see it, right? So the reality is for social companies for whom lobbying a politician is nowhere as important as actually attracting young, new people onto your website, which you can't do by showing them an ad on TV, which young people don't watch. There are natural incentives against it. Lastly, I just want to point out the facts of the world simply show this is not true. Think about all of the dubious democracies in the world which recently passed fake news laws and managed to arm twist many of these large social media companies into abiding by them, right? I simply do not think the characterization is accurate, and there's strong natural checks and balances which suggest that these problems are going to go over. So what is the risk? Why is it that these things are so immensely dangerous and powers we should not give governments in the first place? The reason is because the criteria they set out are big, and I want to go significantly beyond the opening opposition explaining why. The first criteria they say is, we are going to break you up if you have enough lobbying power to buy an election. The question is, what exactly is enough? Because there is no way of measuring this. You can never tell me which particular advertisement which a politician bought, which was funded by which particular company, was the one who helped him win the elections. Elections are complex and multi-causal, and even decades after them, with all the information, we don't know who won for what reason. The moment you give a weak democracy with a sclerotic government, corrupt politicians, weak judges, and regulators appointed by the political powers that lead the ability to decide if your opponents or the person you just ousted from power bought an election, you are handing them a blank check with which to break up any media organization that tries to basically act as a check and balance. And this is not hypothetical. This is literally word for word what the Philippines did to both the Rappler as well as its largest TV broadcaster. They broke them up on the basis that they had too much political influence, when these two broadcasters were the ones who were criticizing Duterte the most vociferously. The reason why we prefer antitrust regulation to focus on measurable things, like are you raising prices? Are you putting in place barriers to entries? That these things might be complicated. Yeah, I grant you that. But they are measurable and not as subject to plausible deniability and political manipulation in the way your criteria are. Similarly, that talk about fake news, which I think applies equally to what the closing government said as well, right? We think governments passing fake news laws with fines is generally kind of disturbing, but we're okay with it because a fine does not devastate your company outright. But when this power allows you to single-handedly destroy a company, it's far more risky for a couple of reasons. The most obvious one is that fake news is a politically contested concept. And I'll take OG. Yeah, if you go for it, OG. Yeah.
If you're a cool young company, as you describe, and then the mechanism doesn't really kick in because you're not tampering with elections. However, if you are like Facebook and you experiment on voters, it does. That's a unique benefit. Whereas you get a non-unique harm, given that the Philippines and Singapore are probably going to do this anyway.
Because your criteria are infinitely extendable. So for instance, you talk about buying elections. What if they just buy a local election for a judge? What if they buy a mayoral election? What if they're maybe not a national monopoly, but a local monopoly? Your criteria admit of no natural limit to how far you can extend these things, right? So even a local startup with very good relations to one politician could eventually be caught under your policy. And this is a real risk, right? So for instance, a sentence like Donald Trump is a sexual predator technically is a false statement because no court has convicted him of actually being a sexual predator. Republicans hate black people is technically fake news because that's never been empirically proven, right? This is a real problem, and you allow countries to massively abuse this, especially when, as the OG themselves point out, there's a deterrent effect to this, right? I'm not saying the status quo is perfect. There will still be bubbles of the sort which CEO talks about. There'll still be fake news. The question is, do we want to let governments decide wholesale with this obscene power what that means and undermine democracy and get rid of the critics in ways which we will never be able to solve? We think we should not take this risk, especially with the natural mechanism for solving it. That's why we're very, very proud to stand in opposition.
All right, I thank the speaker. I now welcome the government whip. You're here.
Audio check, am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool. For clarification to let us win, firstly, onto the opening government. It is true for Ashish to point out that regulation is possible, but it is only for the OG scenario, because the OG problem the OG character identify is this idea about lobbying and etc. Right? But the problem Toshia identified is clearly different from this. We have told you how algorithm is particularly problematic, or how this filter bubble is particularly problematic, or how this incentive of the strategist is particularly important. That is why we choose this option of breaking up, which is particularly different from OG, because what we want to do in the worst case of this breaking up is that we want to get rid of this particular and toxic algorithm, and I think this is the only solution to which we can sustain the democracy. That is why we particularly target this small social media platform. But the second thing which distincts OG and closing government is that our argument is not contingent on the size of the company, but it is contingent on the nature of the company. We are more than happy to intervene and break up those companies, even if it is small, if they have this toxic algorithm, and we're more than happy to take away that particular market brand, or let's say this market branch, for them to benefit. Because if that is harming democracy, I think there are clear justification. That is why it is distinctly different from OG, and all the rebuttals may damage OG but not closing government. But the second thing we need to clarify is the reason why opening opposition is dying out, because I think the main which opening opposition are able to take this debate is by saying that break up will actually happen and people are going to suffer. Firstly, I don't think break up is something likely to happen in the first place, because companies know that is something that they can avoid by changing the algorithm, etc. I don't think those harm are likely to happen. But secondly, at the point in which you conceded that regulation is something they want to do, the question I want to ask you is that what kind of regulation are you going to implement, and what is the punishment for not following that regulation? Is it that some fine? If it is fine, I will say that it's not going to be effective. Example of SoftBank in Japan, which is one of the biggest company, it is consecutively doing tax avoidance, and it's fined by the country again and again. But still, they do tax avoidance. You know why? It is because it's still profitable to do so. That is why we need to break up and take away the branch of the profit that the branch of the business that they're doing, in order to stop that profit mechanism to actually change the incentive structure of this company. That is why opening opposition material also dies. But finally, why closing opposition dies in this debate is because, look, their argument is that this is going to be abused by some dubious democratic country. The first thing you need to understand is that dubiously democratic country will fuck up democracy irregardless, right? As Duterte did, they're gonna find a way possible to make democracy most favorable in their own way. I don't think the counterfactual will be no different at all. But the second thing we need to understand is that the mechanism Tosha provided you is not gonna exist only in the United States, but it can extend to developing country. We told you how this algorithm is particularly damaging the democracy within developing country, and how it is massively damaging the people on that ground. We think this breaking up this particular brand in one country means that it is hard for Apple or Facebook or Twitter to dilute democracy in those countries, right? Because oftentimes headquarters is in one country, and it's not smart idea for Twitter or Facebook to have many branches which which do the exact same business. That is why being broken up means that it is hard for these companies to continue to fuck democracy all over the world. The moment in which this breakup happens in the United States means that the harm to the developing country are also going to be stopped. Based on that, two questions I want to ask you. Will we really end up breaking up this company? But second, even if it happens, why our side is better? So first simple question, will we really need to end up breaking companies? I think I have comprehensively answered this question at the beginning in pointing out why opening opposition lost this debate. But in addition to that, like there's also reason why we're going to be very careful on the execution of this. Why? Because it is also the jury who knows the extent of the impact of breaking up Google, or let's say Facebook, Twitter. They're going to be very careful on doing so because they also want to avoid, societal criticisms. If you're especially talking about Supreme Court, it is that the society has a scrutiny over who are going to be the next, judge in the Supreme Court. That is why they are very sensitive to what the people are going to say. That's why they're going to be very careful with that. But secondly, opening opposition said that court is politicized. That is bad. But I will challenge this premise, right? Look at an example of Donald Trump having a Muslim ban. What have happened is that the Supreme Court stopped this, as president order and said that Muslim ban is actually bad and unconstitutional in those instances. I don't think court is that bad as what their side of the house is saying. That is why I don't think it's likely to be the case. No, not yet. So second, moving on to the second question, even if it happens, why is this important? So dealing with what opening opposition said, they firstly said, they're going to have a cheap product. But number one, I think it's going to be still cheap anyways because competition still goes on. You can go to Twitter if Facebook is banned, and you can go to, let's say, WeChat if Twitter is banned. But secondly, even if it got expensive, to what extent it's going to be expensive, right? Never illustrated by opening opposition. It may be a bit expensive, but what is the harm of that, right? But second thing, they talked about the people connection, go to other sources, right? Thirdly, they talked about there's going to be more innovation in these big tech companies. That's why it's going to be a loss. I will say number one, the reason why these big tech company has more innovation in the status quo is not necessarily because they can take the risk, because startups can also take the risk because their money is not theirs, but it is the investors' money, right? It's not, they can't take risk anyway. But the thing is, startup is suppressed by making an innovation in the first place precisely because of the existence of these big tech companies. So even if we assume the best case scenario from opening opposition, I don't think any of the harm that they're talking about is going to be realistic at the end of the day. Nextly, then, why you should buy closing government analysis? Several reasons. Number one, because of the existence of alternative. As I have told you, there are a bunch of alternatives to the harm that opposition talk about, precisely because of the existence of competition. If Apple is banned, you can go to Samsung, and I don't think that there's going to be a significant difference in the quality of their product. But secondly, the reason why you should buy us is the reversibility of the harm. Note that even if one big company are going to be breaking up, which by the way, we're not going to let them bankrupt. We're just taking away one toxic business branch to avoid the dilution of democracy, right? But even if that is the case, right, reversibility of the harm. So what we have proven to you is that you can, although you can switch to other company, the harm we illustrated to you is immense. In the Philippines, billions of people are literally dying because democracy is taken away. But also in Brazil, because of this dilution of democracy, people don't know how bad their own prime minister is, and resulting in having many coronavirus and people dying. It is literally irreversible form of harm. On the other hand, even if we ban big companies, they're going to be other company, right? These harms are something reversible at the end of the day. But finally, in terms of responsibility, it is the responsibility of these big company that people need to die because of they lose democracy. People literally die to fight for democracy. For all that reason, they have responsibility to secure that. For all that reason, I'm very proud to win this debate.
I thank the speaker. I now welcome the final speaker, opposition with.
Hello, I'm just testing. Can you hear me?
Yeah. It's a bit robotic, but can hear.
Right. A bit what? Softer.
Like robotic, like static-ish.
Maybe that's just a voice,
I don't know if it's just me.
Okay,
my connection, my accent. Okay. Right. I want to firstly deal with Fiji because I think they're largely out of this debate. Fiji's entire premise relies upon this weird mechanism that suggests that we can change the profit incentives of companies by making them more friendly to democracies because now they are afraid of getting broken up. This flies against all of the analysis that comes from the opening government because the entire point of the opening government's case was to suggest that we need to be preemptive such that these companies don't grow large enough to actually serve as a threat, whether it comes from the coffers that they are able to then generate in terms of fighting for political lobbying, or whether it comes to them becoming the only alternative such that it becomes more difficult for us to impose regulations upon them. Which means that the closing government model or mechanism is by far the least realistic one in this entire debate. And therefore, all their other arguments are just generic criticisms of why potentially social media outlets right now are not regulated enough, not actually an argument as to why we need to change antitrust laws to deal with these kinds of companies. So what exactly do we think that we provided in this debate that takes us above the opening exchange? I think the opening exchange relies upon one unique mechanism, and that mechanism is the notion that democratic governments right now have a strong interest and incentive, as well as an ability to ensure that the democratic consolidation and process is well protected. First of all, we suggested to you that the vast majority of democracies in the world don't actually have states that care deeply about these kinds of outcomes, but rather have states that seek to weaponize regulations in a way that empower their own bases. But secondly, I would like to point that this also applies to the vast majority of Western democracies in today's society as well, to the extent to which they're eroding guardrails of the institutional protections of democracy. This means that people like Trump, for instance, have a unique and symmetrical incentive to ensure that these kinds of companies, at the point at which they go against them, can now be shut down as well. What is the unique delta in this debate then? We think that the difference between the notion of antitrust laws and regulations against these kinds of companies or regulations against the opposition is the notion of what public sentiment is like. So in status quo, even if you have a lot of money when it comes to political funding, what the government bench, and I think to an extent the opposition bench misses out, is not just that the quantity remains the same, but rather that no matter how much money you have, that money is less important than public sentiment when it comes to how people turn up at the ballot box. This therefore means that even if you can get billions of dollars from one particular company, if that company is sufficiently unpopular, or if the public sentiment is sufficiently against that company, no amount of money from that company is going to be strong enough to move politicians towards shutting that company, towards like supporting that company at expense of the individuals who are on the ground. But why is this different in this particular scenario? Look, when you have an abusive government, the abusive government is very unlikely to clap down on companies that are against them outright. The reason for this is because even in weak democracies around the world, there is a strong amount of public support for democracies as a whole. Look at countries like Malaysia, like Singapore, for example, even the United States, that care about, Philippines as well, they care about democracy as a fundamental concept and theory, and often rail against governments and perceived attempts of shutting these like oppositional voices down. The problem in this case is that the method of antitrust laws is one that is uniquely capable of providing these forms of regimes a way of shielding and providing them plausible deniability against the excesses of power that don't exist in other scenarios. So what happens now is that while there is negative public sentiment that allows us to, for example, curtail the powers of Facebook or curtail the powers of like other bigger corporations, for instance, what happens is, in order to consolidate your own ability to create authoritarian backslides, such that you tell the public, we are dealing with the big boogeyman, when in actual fact, what you are doing is fighting and using these laws selectively on certain companies that are not currently supporting position. We think that's incredibly problematic. But we see that these kinds of companies are often also the ones, or these monopolies are often also the ones that actually help out the democratic process as opposed to hurt it. First of all, presumably, given that the intermediary that the teams in the opening rely on is the state, and the state is not exactly a intermediary that can be trusted, at least to the extent to which like antitrust laws can be easily weaponized, then we think that they already fail to show a proper mechanism as to how exactly this occurs. But secondarily, companies like Facebook, for example, actually act as a strong check against presumably like more authoritarian and problematic governments in countries like the Philippines, etc. The reason for this is because these companies have a sufficient amount of capital to be able to stand up against like fines or sanctions that are levied against them, because they can weaponize the idea that the government is fighting against them, for instance. But secondarily, I would suggest that on top of that, there's also a few reasons why monopolistic companies are better for democracy as well. So the first thing being that if they can, like the stuff that Ashish gave you about structural reasons why they have an incentive to self-regulate when it comes to garnering that same public sentiment that attempts to fight for democracy on the ground. So you use that same theoretical desire for democracy that even weak democracies have in order to push these monopolistic companies towards using their largesse for good and greater democratic aid. But secondly, suggests that the idea of a monopoly versus multiple small intermediaries is presumably a lot easier to regulate as well. But before I move on, I'll take one from OG.
Presumably, you're still happy with regulating, the spread of fake news. Isn't it then the same? And why is it that you can regulate fake news and the Philippines won't abuse it, but they will definitely abuse this one specific mechanism that is for some reason non-exclusive?
Right, because the notion of antitrust law is very, very different in that the notion of fake news is already a politicized concept, something that Ashish already talked about. The difference is the notion of antitrust law is uniquely different in that you use economic arguments, but also existing suspicion of these big giant conglomerations in order to try and create plausible deniability for the kind of sneaky shit that you are doing against this thing. Okay, I just lost the ability to say that in a more sophisticated manner. But next, the reason and the recent, for example, interrogation of these big companies in front of Congress in the US, for example, is a great example of how big monopolistic corporations are actually far more better held to task than small intermediaries. Look, all of the problems that the OG and the OO want to talk about presumably exist on either side. The difference is when you're talking about a specific monopoly, and what you are able to therefore do is that even if these monopolies are doing kind of weird stuff, the first thing to note is that you can target the regulations against one specific corporation that also has the ability to fend off these regulations. This doesn't exist when you're talking about medium or smaller size enterprises that people would then say are going to be stuffed out by the government. You are far more able to scrutinize bigger companies and impose these regulations upon them because both sides recognize that these companies can survive through that. As a result, we would suggest that in the best case scenario, they act as a bulwark against authoritarianism. But secondly, in the worst case scenario, we can better regulate them. The crucial thing to note, however, is that the differentiating factor here is what the democracy could potentially exploit this particular trust law to do to these companies, which we think is something that is problematic and we ought to avoid.
All right, I thank the speaker. I thank everyone. You guys may head back to the main Zoom room while the judges stay here and deliberate. Thank you.
Thank you.